Hi, I'm Natalie Bouchard, and you're listening to Inside NC Labor, a podcast designed to inform and educate North Carolina citizens on the role that the Department of Labor plays in state government.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to Inside NC Labor. I am Dolores Questenberry. I am a public information officer in the communications office, and I am joined by Natalie Bouchard, who is also a public information officer. Today we have Paul Sullivan as our guest. He's the Western Compliance Bureau Chief for the Occupational Safety and Health Division. And I'm really excited about this podcast today because I think it's going to be so interesting to hear about this particular case that we're going to talk about. It's a fatality investigation that happened in the western part of the state. And Paul's going to cover some of the things that they looked at and some of the things that happened with this particular case. So, Paul, why don't you kick this off by first telling us a little bit about your background here at NCDOL?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Just a little bit about myself. I started working for the Department of Labor back in 1993, so almost 28 years ago. And I came in as a health compliance officer, and I came in right out of graduate school in Chicago. And when I started, I came on board with really a couple dozen or more other health and safety inspectors in the period following the tragic fire in Hamlet that occurred back in 1991. And when I came on board was when our staff was tripling in size. And I worked as a health compliance officer or an OSH inspector for about 3 years. And then I was promoted in 1996 to a district supervisor. And I oversaw a district out of the Charlotte office. And I worked in that position for almost 20 years. And then in 2017, I moved into the West Compliance Bureau Chief position. And I've been in that job for just a little over 4 years now. And in the current position I have, I oversee all OSHA compliance activities for the western half of North Carolina, which includes about 57 inspectors and 6 supervisors. In a typical non-pandemic year, my staff will do about 2,000 inspections and about maybe 30 or 40 fatalities a year.
That's a lot.
Wow.
Yeah. So does this mean you've been with the department about 28 years?
That's correct. This summer it'll be 28 years.
Wow.
That's impressive, Paul.
Very. Well, getting right into the investigation, can you explain how your office was notified of the fatality and who was sent to the scene of the accident first?
Sure. We have a couple reporting requirements with OSHA. One of them is for fatalities, and the other is for hospitalizations and amputations and loss of eye injuries. But for fatalities, employers have 8 hours or 8 clock hours to report the fatality to OSHA. And they can do that through the hotline, through our number with the department. They can also notify the State Capitol Police. But it does include nighttime hours and weekend hours. And so they have 8 hours to report it. And this fatality occurred at about 10:47 p.m., and it was reported to the North Carolina State Capitol Police at 3:55 a.m. So they met the 8-hour reporting requirement. I was notified a few minutes later by phone, and then I followed up with the employer by phone to get some additional information and to determine what was going on currently at the site. You know, sometimes they hold the scene waiting for us to get there. Other times the scene is secure and we can come in a few hours later. And that was the case here, is that the scene had been secured and the facility was closed. And so we didn't need to send somebody out at 5 a.m. If I don't have to wake somebody up at 5 a.m., I don't want to do so. But based on that, like I said, we got 2 inspectors out there first thing in the morning, and they arrived about 10 o'clock to begin their fatality investigation.
And so, Paul, can you set the stage for us by describing exactly what happened and just tell us a little bit about this plant where this incident happened?
Sure. This was a large manufacturing plant in the western half of North Carolina. It's just a very large building with some outbuildings, and there's several parking lots. And in this particular case, the fatality events were that a 56-year-old truck driver had parked his rig in one of the parking lots, and he had turned in some paperwork, and he was walking through the loading dock area to another parking lot where his personal vehicle was located. And so, again, the fatality occurred at about 10:47 p.m., so it was after dark. And if you can kind of picture a dock area with the giant concrete pad where trailers will be backed up to a building for loading and unloading of raw materials or final product, that was kind of the area where the accident occurred. And as he was walking through that loading dock area, about 10:45 p.m., he was struck by what they call a switcher truck, which is a truck that's used to move trailers around. It's almost like a mini tractor trailer, the tractor part of it, that they use to move the trailers. So if they have them move them from one dock door to another, or from a dock door to a staging area, they'll use this little switcher truck to do that. And he was walking through the dock area, and he was struck by the switcher truck, and he was pronounced deceased at the scene.
So once the compliance officer arrived at the scene, what were their first priorities? What took place there?
Really, as with all fatality inspections, the compliance officers, inspect the area, they take measurements, they interview employees and managers. They're going to reach out to the fire and the police. Often those folks are already gone. Incident command usually has been terminated by that point, and so we have to kind of follow up with fire and police to get some additional information and to get their photos from the scene. We'll also look at the employer's safety and health programs that are applicable to the accident, but really we're trying to collect as much evidence as we can to figure out what happened and to determine if there's anything that we're going to be able to cite, any kind of violation.
So in this case, what was the primary goal of the compliance officer during the investigation?
Like with all of our inspections, some of our inspections are programmed or proactive, where we're looking for, hazards before an accident occurs or in response to a complaint. This was kind of a reactive inspection. It's after an accident, and so we're trying to piece together what happened. But the primary goal of any of our inspections is to identify possible violations of OSHA regulations, and then to collect sufficient evidence to support the issuance of citations for those violations, which is how we ensure the hazards have been corrected. So, if we fall short of that, we could issue a recommendation letter, but the recommendation letter is just that. It's a recommendation. The employers don't have to follow that. The only way that we can implement corrective action and require a company to implement that action is to issue a citation. And that is our goal, on any of these inspections, is to identify those violations, collect the evidence, and issue the citations so that we can get that also important corrective action for the future.
What were some of the biggest challenges on this particular investigation?
Probably the biggest challenges here is that the issues and the hazards that we identified, or that the compliance officers identified, were not covered by OSHA standards. When that happens, it requires us to cite under what we call the General Duty Clause of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of North Carolina. And that act, the General Duty Clause of that act, requires employers to furnish employees with a place of employment that is free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious injury. So when we don't have an OSHA standard and we have identified a problem or an issue or a hazard that may have caused this accident or caused the fatality, we have to address it under the General Duty Clause. And probably the biggest challenge with that is the whole recognized hazard part. We are safety and health professionals, and we can look at something and say that that's a hazard, but it can't just be recognized by us. It can't be recognized by the OSHA people. Someone else has to recognize that it's a hazard. And the hazard, what makes it even trickier, is that it's not the hazard is not the event itself, but the hazard is the specific deficiency that we've identified. So if we're saying that there's a hazard, that's a deficiency. So an example of that would be forklift operators. There's no standard that requires forklift operators to wear seatbelts. But clearly, if the forklift turns over and the operator is ejected from the forklift and can be crushed by the overhead protection, that clearly is a hazard. But that's not the hazard we have to show that is recognized. The hazard that we have to show is recognized is the lack of seatbelts or the failure to wear seatbelts. So we have to show that somebody says you got to wear a seatbelt when operating a forklift. Now, that's a really easy example because fortunately, if you open up the operator's manual for a forklift, there will be at least a dozen warnings that say you must wear your seatbelt when operating this forklift. The same thing applies to UTVs and other vehicles. We have a lot of accidents, fatalities that involve failure to wear a seatbelt, and we cite those under the General Duty Clause, and we use the operator's manual to show that it was a recognized hazard. So that's one of the things that we have to overcome for the general duty clause. But that's the issue that we had in this particular case.
That's interesting and complex. Well, it's basically a catch-all when there is no standard, right, Paul?
That is correct, and that's the language is very broad in the OSH Act of North Carolina, and so if there's no OSHA standard that applies, we will take a step back, and we will then apply the general duty clause if we can. It's a higher bar, and it's harder to get there, but we cited a lot. I think I looked it up a few months ago, and we had cited it we'd cited like 450 general duty clause citations in the last 5 years. So it's something that we're getting very good at. And it would be, for example, with COVID, if we were going to cite a company for COVID issues, for not wearing masks or social distancing, we would have had to address it under the general duty clause. But again, we'd have to show that somebody is recognizing those issues, such as CDC or another agency. We would have to show that some other agency recognizes those deficiencies as a hazard.
So, Paul, I'm getting a little off track here, but are most of those general duty clause citations upheld?
We have a lot of success in having those kind of things upheld. Often they're not challenged often, simply because we're very serious on this. We make sure that we have the evidence, to issue a general duty clause citation. We don't just, throw it out there and see if it sticks. We actually do the work and make sure that we have sufficient evidence and sufficient proof that it's a recognized hazard before we try to issue the citation.
So in this case, back to this case, what were the findings in the case, and were any occupational safety and health standards violated?
Yeah, they were, and there were a couple citations that were issued in this case, and really, as with a lot of cases, the compliance officer and their supervisor, they took a close look at the evidence, and they really kind of brainstormed for possible violations that may have led to the fatal accident. The one thing that was clear is that the truck drivers were required to park their trucks in one area, drop off their travel documents, and then they had to walk through the loading dock area to their personal vehicles, sometimes after dark. And so some of the stuff that we brainstormed was the lack of a crosswalk. There was a crosswalk just across the two-lane road, but other than that one crosswalk, there were no sidewalks or other designated walking areas along the rest of the path to the parking lot, nor were there any speed bumps or rumble strips to limit the vehicular speed. So that was one of the issues that we looked at. There was also very little illumination. It was very dark. Keeping in mind this was after sunset, a couple hours after sunset at least, and it was very dark in the area. So those were two of the things that we had initially brainstormed. But again, there's no OSHA standards for these things, so we had to determine if they were recognized, if the absence of a sidewalk or speed bumps or those kind of things were recognized by anybody. And for that item, for the sidewalks and the designated walking areas, there's really no consensus standard out there that recommends these be installed. I mean, it would be a great idea, but there's not enough out there for us to say, yes, this agency says you must have sidewalks or you must have designated walking areas. And so because of that, we were not able to address those issues from an OSHA compliance perspective. But the concern about the lighting was a different story entirely. The American National Standards Institute, ANSI, and the Illumination Engineering Society actually have published some minimum recommended illuminance levels for safety around a building exterior. And so that was a good place for us to start with regard to the lighting, and that those levels range from about 0.5 foot candles for an area with low activity level and a slight hazard, all the way up to 2 foot candles for low activity and a high hazard, such as we had here, with a potential for being struck by a vehicle. And so our inspectors measured the illuminance levels at several dozen locations around the accident site and found that most of the levels were between 0 and 0.4 foot candles. So only 20% of the recommended illuminance level for the low activity, high hazard area. And so what that showed us is that, number one, there is an agency or there's a group out there who publishes some minimum light levels for safety. And we found that this location was only about 20% of what was expected. And so based on that evidence, and our measurements, we went ahead and issued a general duty clause citation for the inadequate lighting in that area. And so that was one of the citations. And then the other area that we had looked at, employees were walking in that area near vehicular traffic, and they were not wearing high visibility vests or clothing. And so again, the no standard thing, we had to deal with that again. And so, but there was one question that we looked at. We looked at the personal protective equipment standard, which says that protective equipment is necessary whenever required by reasons of hazards of processes or environments. But the question that we had to have answered here is that is a high visibility vest or high vis clothing, is that considered protective equipment? Is that considered personal protective equipment? And that's a question that's probably up for debate, but there is a federal OSHA interpretation from 1984, so several decades old, that does say that it is personal protective equipment. So we also issued a citation for that, for the failure to require highly visible vests or clothing while walking through that area, and also for not doing a personal protective equipment assessment for that area to establish what may be needed in that area. So those were the other citations that were issued.
So once the citations were issued, did the employer take corrective action?
Yes, that's actually the thing that we're looking for on every inspection is that corrective action. That's what we do this for. But yes, they were very cooperative. The employer was very cooperative during the inspection, and they took immediate corrective action. They installed a significant amount of new lighting in the loading dock area, and they also require the use of the high-vis vests when walking through the area. The before and after difference, when you look at the photos from before the abatements and after the abatements, for the lighting, it literally is night and day. So I hate to use that terminology like that, but it is lit up wonderfully in that area. So it's, looking forward down the road as other people walk through that area at that same time of night, they are going to be in a much better situation because of the lighting that was added by the employer.
That's great. So you're confident then, it sounds like, that moving forward, the employer has taken the proper measures to prevent this from happening again?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We, like I mentioned before, we do a good number of programmed inspections where we are proactively looking for hazards before an accident occurs.
Right.
However, on accident cases like this, our primary goal is to issue legally defensible citation, which then requires the employer to implement that corrective action. And that's what we're after. We're after, we can't do anything about this accident. It was tragic. They lost an employee that had been there for over 10 years. We can't do anything about that. All we can do is ensure that the people in the future at this work site are protected. That's our goal, is to do the best we can to put together a citation that will require that corrective action, and that's what they've done here.
Well, I know those types of investigations are tough for you guys, but it must be rewarding in a way moving forward that you know that possibly you've prevented this from happening, or another employee, being hit and killed at work.
Yes, absolutely. And that's really, I'm very proud of our agency. I'm very proud of the way that we look at these inspections and the professionalism of our staff. But that's really one of the main things that has kept me here all these years is that I know that the work we do, we don't get to see directly the fruits of our labor. We don't get to see, who was saved, who goes home at the end of the day that otherwise would not have, except for a correction that was made, an abatement that was made by an employer, whether it's a machine guarding or a lockout tagout. Somewhere, at some point, at some location, somebody's going to go home that otherwise would not have.
Right.
And it's a combination of the work that our staff does, but also the employers, industry groups, consultants. We're all in this together to try to keep the employees safe.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for all that you do for the Department of Labor and for all the workers out there. And,
my pleasure.
Yeah, I certainly learned a lot.
We learn a lot every day. That's another interesting part of this job is that you're never doing the same thing over and again. You're learning something new. Like I mentioned earlier on this one, we brainstormed. We sat down, brainstormed. What are the issues here? What are things that could have been done or should have been done different to prevent this accident? What can we do in the future to prevent future accidents? And that's what's every case is a learning experience for us.
Thanks so much for tuning in, y'all. Remember, your safety is our priority.